They have those clipboards.
You're online.
We're online. Okay.
Yes.
So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So we are doing something new for the first time this morning. Actually, we did a live video a few days ago at the end of our marketing meeting. And we were so happy to be done with the marketing meeting that I told a joke. And we decided as part of our marketing meeting that we would experiment with doing live video feeds for Sunday morning Zen Talks. We are in the process of buying a tripod, which we'll have next week. But for now, June is holding an iPad and videoing me. And so I want to welcome all of you this morning. I also want to welcome anyone who's watching this live from your home on Facebook, or anyone that watches this in the future. So this is a little strange. I'm going to give a talk this morning on the power of forgiveness, and then next week I'll be giving a retreat on the power of forgiveness that will begin Friday night and all day Saturday. Forgiveness is it is really a matter of the heart. It's a matter of healing the heart. And we don't talk a lot about forgiveness in the Buddhist tradition, but we have a lot of practices that are related to the process of forgiving. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to that is forgiveness is a choice. You can choose to forgive someone, and you can choose not to forgive someone. It's completely up to you. And so what I want to explore with you this morning is why you might want to make a choice to forgive somebody, or at least consider it. I'm not saying you have to do that. No pressure here to forgive anybody. But I would like to invite you to entertain the possibility of choosing to forgive someone if someone has hurt you. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. Forgiveness has everything to do with justice. That is, anyone here that hasn't been hurt by somebody, maybe you're fortunate, some people haven't. Anyone here that hasn't been betrayed, abused, treated unjustly by someone, by a parent, by a family member, by a teacher? I don't see any hands, so you all have. So you all know, everyone, all of us know what it feels like to be treated with injustice. And forgiveness is not about denying that injustice. It's not about forgetting it and moving on. Forgiveness is about acknowledging that someone did something to you that was unjust, and you didn't deserve that treatment. And you have some anger as a result, and that anger is fully justified because you didn't deserve that. No one deserves to be treated in a way that is disrespectful and unfair and unjust. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
So forgiveness begins by acknowledging that somebody hurt you and you have feelings about that. And you could choose to forgive that person by extending an act of mercy and compassion towards them, and even though they may not deserve it. That's what we're talking about this morning, is the possibility of extending your goodness, extending mercy, an act of mercy towards someone who has hurt you, and they may not deserve it. We're not talking about reconciliation. Reconciliation always includes forgiveness, but the act of forgiveness is not necessarily an act of reconciliation. In other words, you don't need the other person to forgive you too in order to forgive them. We're talking about something here really powerful. I went through a period of my life before we started the Zen Center here where I was hurt by somebody, and I spent more than a year of my life really depressed, lost my footing, really depressed. I was depressed. I didn't think I had anything to teach, and I felt like a victim for a year, over a year. Do you know what that feeling is like, to feel like a victim? Anyone want to say something about that? You don't need to name names about people that have hurt you. I don't want to get into specifics. And I don't want to re-traumatize any of you either if you had a really traumatic experience. But can we explore for a moment gently, what is it like when you feel like a victim, either if you feel like one now or if you felt like that in the past? What is that feeling like for you? Anybody?
I was thinking about that because I've been preparing for the new year, and the feeling that came up for me was shame. And that was a very opening experience too, because I think I've been holding anger and pain, whatever, but I really kind of was going deeper and looking that there's also something about the shame involved in that sense, and that I deserved it, that I wasn't lovable or likable. So that was a very...
So there's a kind of directing, an inner criticism that you direct towards yourself, the blaming of yourself. Yes.
Powerless.
Yes. It's a very disempowered place, isn't it? Yeah, you've been victimized by somebody else, and all your thoughts are about that person.
Sometimes it involves a feeling of less than. Less than
Others, them,
the world.
comparing yourself.
Right.
Maybe you're comparing yourself to the person that treated you unfairly, and maybe you see them excelling in the world, and then there's you feel totally inadequate as a result. That's a possibility.
I think I've experienced a feeling of, there's kind of like a wallowing that happens sometimes.
Yes, a ruminating.
And then it's like, it just starts to build and build. It's like a snowball effect, and it picks up everything.
Yeah.
And besides then there's so-and-so, and there's this, and it just kind of like picks up all of the wrongs of the world.
Yeah.
Not just against me, but against everybody, because it's against me. That just happens, and it just gets really icky.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's tiring. It's exhausting. You may actually be really depressed. And
that was the word I was thinking of to finish what you're saying. It is exhausting.
Yeah.
Exhausting because you're dwelling on this thing longer and longer, and it expands, like you said. So exhausting. What?
I think revenge.
Yeah.
Seeing my own dark side rise.
Yeah, absolutely. You want revenge. You want to get even. And if something terrible should happen to that person, you would celebrate that. You might not openly admit that to anyone else, but you would celebrate their misfortune.
And even envisioning myself committing those acts.
Absolutely. You could imagine late at night when you can't get to sleep, all those things you could do. You could burn down their house. Throw rocks through their window. I know exactly what you're talking about. We're on the same page here. I got excited about thinking about the revenge. Yeah. Discouragement, yes. Yeah. So I don't want to dwell too much on this because we'll all get depressed. And I want to point out to you that, and those of you who are listening from Facebook, that the mission of the Zen Center, our mission is to empower you to live a Zen-inspired life of openness, empathy, and clarity. To live a Zen-inspired life is the opposite of being a victim. It's the opposite of an impoverished mentality. It's to live a Zen-inspired life is to know that there is some richness and sanity and goodness in you, and that the world is good, that you can make friends with the world and operate and function in the world skillfully and be of service to others. Now the trouble with not forgiving, the trouble with being caught in this web of not only wanting revenge on somebody who has mistreated you, but feeling anger and resentment, is that not only do you get wounded by the first act that somebody did to you, but you get wounded many times over afterwards. There's lots of evidence that when we when anger decides to come and sit in your heart and reside there too long, that it turns into resentment. And when that anger festers in your heart and you allow it to do so, it's very common for people to start to blame themselves. As Carol was mentioning with shame, you start to actually direct that anger towards yourself. You're less than. That makes sense? So that's a second one. And part of the anatomy of depression that we know about is that when people are in the grips of depression, they usually have a very strong, toxic inner critic. Toxic. Crippling. Shame is crippling. So the problem here is that you may have every right to feel, you have every right to have the anger that you were treated in such a way by another person. But the problem is that if you dwell in that anger and you ruminate with it and you fester with it, you hurt yourself again. You wound yourself. Not only did you suffer the first wound of the injustice, but now you suffer a second wound. You become depressed. You become resentful. And now you suffer other wounds, don't you? It starts to compromise the relationships of the people you love. Doesn't it? So I want you to think about this carefully, because there are enough, I learned about forgiveness in the way that I'm teaching it now from Bob Enright, who's a teacher at the University of Wisconsin and has studied forgiveness for at least 15 years and has done quite a bit of clinical trials and studies with control groups to study forgiveness, and has discovered that there are real benefits to forgiving in the way that he's teaching it and that I'm teaching it to you. He has done studies with people in drug rehabilitation, a drug rehabilitation program where the clients were angry and anxious and depressed, and found that compared to the control group that didn't do the forgiveness process, the people that went through the forgiveness training came out the other end with less anger, less anxiety, less depression. And that generally holds true for, they've done more than 10 or 15 studies with different demographics, with kids at risk in Belfast schools in Ireland, with drug rehabilitation, women that had been abused. And what they found, and I'm generalizing now, I'm not going to any one specific study, but what they found, they did a study with heart patients. And the patients that participated in the study had anger, and they had a myocardial flow of the heart. I may be mispronouncing that, but they had when we have anger, it actually constricts the arteries in the heart. And the heart patients that went through the forgiveness study, they discovered, first of all, they had less anger at the end, but they also had a healthier heart. So there are real benefits to forgiving if you're not convinced that it's worth making that choice. But one thing that I know from doing a lot of counseling and working with people is that when we are stuck in life, and we all get stuck, it's just part of being a human being. When we get stuck, we're not aware that we're making that choice to be stuck. That sounds like an awfully uncompassionate thing to say, but actually it's the most compassionate thing to clarify. When we are stuck, life seems to be happening to us. Depression is just happening. You don't know where it's coming from, but it gets you the minute you wake up in the morning. You don't want to get out of bed. You're not aware at that point that you're making a choice to be depressed. When we're feeling anxious and stressed out, we're not aware that on some level we're choosing to do that. Now you might say that's an awful kind of thing to say, but actually it's not. Because when you get that you are choosing for some good reason, some defense mechanism to be depressed or to be angry or to be resentful, when you get that you are making that choice, that's actually empowering. That's the beginning, the first step of being empowered. And we're not saying you're making the wrong choice, we're just saying you're making a choice for some good reason, and there's another deeper reason having to do with some constructs and assumptions that you've internalized that you're no longer even conscious of that is holding that choice in place. And part of how I understand therapy is that you're going through a process where you become aware of that choice you're making and the reason why you're making it, and then the deeper unconscious constructs that are holding that choice in place. And when you become aware of those deeper constructs, human beings are amazing. We integrate. We have an inherent wisdom within us. So that when you become more mindful of the choice you're making and why you're making it, and you explore and become more conscious of some of the things that you are carrying unconsciously, you naturally integrate and make better choices, or make a different choice that serves you better. Is that making sense? Anyone want to say any questions about what I'm saying so far? Okay.
Makes sense.
So forgiveness is a choice, and I want to stress that it is a choice, and we can choose to forgive or we can choose not to. And I would suggest that the consequences of not forgiving are less vitality, more likely that you will have less self-worth, more likely that you will be depressed, more likely that you will be tired, discouraged, and it will probably change your outlook on the world and on the people around you, and will really become toxic, and your heart dries up and becomes bitter. So let me talk for a moment about how forgiveness is connected to our Buddhist tradition, because it may not be so obvious, because we don't talk about forgiveness usually directly in terms of Buddhist teachings, but we have a lot of teachings that are connected to it. So the first teaching that comes to mind for me is equanimity. Equanimity is one of the 7 factors of awakening, which are mindfulness, investigation of dharmas, energy, rapture, calm, concentration, and equanimity. And equanimity is considered to be one of the highest virtues in the Buddhist tradition, one of the highest wholesome qualities we can practice and actualize. The Pali word for it is upekkha, and it literally means there in the middleness. So the characteristic of equanimity is evenness and a highly developed, unshakable balance of mind, a kind of groundedness. There are groups of wholesome mental factors that usually arise together, according to the Buddhist teachings. these wholesome states of mind include faith or confidence, mindfulness, self-respect, non-greed, non-hatred, and pliancy or flexibility, or there's another word we use in the primers a lot, being, the word escapes me, but the point here is that these states of mind usually arise together. And equanimity is a balance that we can have, which doesn't, it does not give in to what are called the 8 worldly vicissitudes. And these are gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute, pleasure and pain. When we are feeling like a victim, when we are not living an inspired life, we're often blaming somebody. The microphone. If this doesn't go well, I'm going to blame June. The iPad that's doing the video. We're often blaming somebody. Equanimity has something to do with insight into the nature of who we are, who we really are, and what the reality really is, the nature of impermanence, and that everyone is doing their best, and that everyone is basically good. Everyone deserves respect. No one deserves to be disrespected. Everyone is basically good. Equanimity is also one of what are called the 4 Brahma Viharas, which are wholesome qualities taught in the Buddhist tradition, or they're sometimes called the divine abodes. And they are loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. Those sound like good qualities to have as a human being? Maybe you can even say to have joy in someone else's excellence, to celebrate someone else's accomplishments. Well, there's a kind of impartiality that comes with equanimity, an ability to hold situations and to not react, not to blame, not to take sides necessarily. Along with the other Brahma Viharas, equanimity gives all of these qualities a kind of boundlessness. And this boundless quality is the nature of compassion that is taught in our tradition, that we actually practice cultivating a universal compassion for all human beings, regardless of whether we like them or not. That we can actually cultivate a state of mind where we feel compassion for all human beings. Now, granted, that's a difficult undertaking. There are always people that are going to push our buttons, but that's what we're talking about today, is those people that push our buttons. Those are the people, that's where we need to practice. And I think the good news is that if we approach this with some thoughtfulness, we'll realize that actually when forgiveness comes up as an issue in our life, it's a window, an opportunity to grow. It's an opportunity to learn something about ourselves, that we could be larger, that you could be larger. So regarding equanimity, we have a famous poem called On Faith Mind by the 3rd ancestor, and part of it goes this way. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When attachment and aversion are both absent, the way is clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart.
Could you read that again?
Yeah. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When attachment and aversion are both absent, the way is clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set apart. Wow. Okay. Now, forgiveness is also related to what the third paramita in our tradition. We usually talk about the 6 paramitas, and the third paramita is about patience or forbearance, and it is a huge practice. Don't have enough time to do it justice here, but I'll just touch on it because it's related to the process of forgiving. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the forgiveness process here this morning because we'll do that in the retreat next week. Patience is the antidote to aggression and irritation. And we say in our tradition that the most difficult root, the most difficult klesha or unwholesome quality to cut the root of karmically is our own aggression. It's the most difficult thing to cut all the way. You know, I think, oh, I have no aggression, but then you get aggressive just defending that. I'm not aggressive. Really. It's very tricky, and we have all kinds of irritations that come up, impatience. My own teacher used to always tell me to be patient, and I hated hearing it. He'd say, Joe should be more patient. Yeah. Had a very hard time with that. And I always have a funny story about patience. You know, patience can be practiced with the small things. So when June and me we had a house that we used to have down the street here, and we used to get the Chicago Tribune, and they'd throw the paper boy would throw the paper on the front porch. You know, and we had one of these big Victorian houses that has a high porch. So in the wintertime, I'd come out and look through the window at the front door to see if the paper had come. And sometimes it wasn't there, and then I kind of grumbled at June, oh, he's late this morning, inconveniencing my schedule. And then I'd look a little more, and I'd see, oh, he just missed the porch completely. The paper is down in the snow in the front yard. So now I'm really grumbling because now I got to put on layers. I got to put on my shoes. I got to put on coats and hats and gloves and everything. And I'm grumbling. I get the paper, come back in. You know, in the larger scheme of things, that's just bourgeois suffering. That is really not going to help me deal with the larger issues of life when they come upon me, when someone dies, when someone gets sick, when you're going to need your resources of patience. If you don't practice patience with small things, then you will probably not have so much of it when you need it. So patience is a huge virtue. Now the conventional notions of patience is that you just wait a long time, you kind of do your duty. But that kind of patience is kind of a cold virtue. You can have resentment with that kind of patience, but the resentment is aggression. We're talking about giving up aggression. So patience is really about bearing witness. What are you bearing witness to? Yourself. Bearing your own existence. Being with yourself as you are. Accepting yourself as you are. Well, that could be kind of tough. We often don't like who we are. Shame is a good example. We often don't feel like we're good enough. It's almost epidemic proportions in our culture, and in many ways it's unconscious. So patient means to be able to bear yourself. And isn't that what meditation is really about? Is sitting still with yourself? It's not a technique. It's about being able to be with yourself. So aggression is dangerous because when we are in the grip of anger and aggression, there's no room for any kind of gentleness at all. There's no room for any kind of awareness of needs in ourselves or in others. We often can direct that aggression towards ourselves as well. When you lose your temper, you could care less about anything. Care less about the world being a sacred place. You care less about that. So patience means that we're willing to wait and see how something unfolds. We don't have to jump to a conclusion so quickly. That means bearing witness. Do you know what I mean by that? Bearing witness. And that is exactly what is required in order to forgive somebody. That is exactly what is required. Is bearing witness to your pain. Bearing witness to your anger, which is fully justified. Bearing witness to your rage. Patience, like anger, is sharp and clear. You know it when you see it. You know anger when you see it, and you know patience when you see it. It's not ambiguous. And you know the difference in yourself as well. And you know it when you see it in others. We could go further. I don't want to go too much further into the paramita, but it really relates to forgiveness in many ways. And so one of the teachings in this paramita is 3 different kinds of patience. And 2 have to do with the relative side, and 1 has to do with the absolute. And I'll explain that in a moment. But the first kind of patience is to have patience with other people's aggression. That when someone is attacking you, you don't treat that as an attack. You are able to reframe that, and you don't return you don't attack back. You don't have to get even. There's no sense of needing to retaliate. And if you don't return that kind of aggressive projection, then the person who's angry at you has no fuel to burn. You know what I'm saying? There's an analogy for this somewhere. I think it's in the Tao Te Ching about someone's out on a boat in a lake and it's foggy, and someone comes up and hits their boat in the fog, and they start yelling and cussing out that other boat, and then they look over to see who's the culprit, the blame in the boat, and there's nobody in the other boat. Their anger is like a bubble, it just gets popped. There's no if you can't hang your aggression on some other sentient being, then there's no fun in doing it. It just kind of all just blows. What's the point? Well, you can be angry at a boat. I've been angry at computers before. You ever been angry? Yeah, but it's not as satisfying though as a real human being. Again, I speak from personal experience. So, the point here is that we can actually, if we're practicing living in a Zen-inspired life, which is a choice, a principled way of behaving, and have some sense of your own richness, you don't have to respond in kind to someone's aggression. You absolutely can sink down and be patient. It's possible. You don't have to respond in kind. So patience with other people's aggression. And the other one is to realize that the aggression and the destructiveness, the person who's doing that also has pain. That they have had perhaps they were abused as a child, and now they have abused you or done something to you. So you're reframing. And a lot of the work of of forgiveness, the process of forgiveness, and the way we come to be more compassionate is to begin to reframe what was done, the person that did something to us. Because what you've been doing up to this point is you've been looking at that person through a very narrow lens of what they did to you. And in the process of forgiveness that we'll explore in the retreat next week, we begin to ask questions about that person. Well, what else do you know about that person other than you've just been thinking in this very narrow way about what they did to you. But maybe they have a family, and they have a couple of kids, and they send them to school, and they love their kids, and they do various things in the world. They have all kinds of other things they do that you're not thinking of. And they may have been really hurt, and you may not even be aware of the kind of wounds and hurt that they carry. So you begin to reframe the situation so that you begin to have more compassion for that person that hurt you. It's not saying we're excusing or condoning what they did to you. It's just saying you're able to begin to, if you've made the choice to forgive, then that sets a series of possibilities in motion. And then the last piece here, and then I'll go a little bit more into forgiveness. The last piece about patience is that you actually see it from the absolute point of view, which is the non-dual point of view, which is the actual irritation itself is empty. And when you really begin to explore more specifically what this anger is, what the injustice, the whole thing is not nearly so solid as you thought it was. And that's the larger global way of looking at this from a point of universal compassion you could actually begin to appreciate. That's a harder place to appreciate things from. But it's part of our tradition. It's part of our teaching. But we don't use that absolute point of view to deny the relative. It's really important that we not use the absolute to deny the real suffering that we have. And then we have to work with. We have to bear witness to it. Any questions about that? And if not, I'll go on a little bit to talk about the forgiveness process itself. Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Yeah.
I think when I talk with people about forgiveness, they feel that they don't want to forgive someone because it'll happen again.
Yes, that's very common.
Mm-hmm.
It's a common misperception, I think, a misunderstanding of forgiveness is if you forgive someone, you're opening yourself to being hurt again. But I think that's not what we're speaking about here. You're not saying when you forgive someone, you're not denying that the act that they did was damaging and hurtful. And you're not in any way opening yourself up to having to subject yourself to that again. Although I think that's a very common feeling that people have. So I'll get to some of the misperception of forgiveness in a second before we finish. So the process of forgiveness. I'll tell you about this process of forgiveness that I learned from Bob Enright, and it's kind of a little funny aside, which was this. I learned this. June and me went to a White Plum meeting earlier this year at Myoyu Roshi's Zen Center in Wisconsin, and it was an annual meeting of the White Plum teachers, and she had talked for at least a year before the meeting about inviting this dude that I never heard of, Bob Enright, who was going to do a whole day teaching on forgiveness. And I said to myself, I want to make sure I miss that day. And I tried in every way to miss that day, and I thought I had succeeded, except my teacher came from San Diego, and she wanted to go to it, so I was stuck. And I was totally stuck, and there was no way out, and I couldn't worm my way out of it, and there was no escape, and so I ended up kicking and screaming. I got dragged into going to this workshop and discovered that it was just wonderful to my surprise and felt extremely grateful to Robert Enright for the work he's done. He's completely committed to this work, and quite a spectacular human being. So, briefly, the process that we'll be exploring in the retreat next week is we go through preliminaries. And the preliminaries are exploring who hurt you, when, specifically what they did, what time of day was it, what were you wearing, what memories do you have of it. We really explore, and you pick one person that betrayed you, that abused you, and we talk about how to come to terms with that. If you're coming to the workshop, bring a journal. I'll be asking you to do some writing. And how did you respond to what they did? That's the preliminaries. We're just exploring who hurt you. When was it? Was it in your childhood? Was it last week? 2 years ago? Where was it? When was it? Who was it? And what did you do? How did you respond? And then the first phase of the forgiveness process is to begin to uncover the anger. How have you been dealing with that ever since? And we really go in, just really starting to work with bearing witness to the pain, which is not often where we want to go, right? We're usually avoiding that. It's too painful. But if we're part of doing this is considering the possibility of making the choice to forgive that person. I'm not suggesting that you make that choice cold turkey. I'm suggesting would you be willing to consider a process of forgiving this person, knowing that it may benefit you in the end, even though you can't see that now. Would you be willing to entertain going through this process? If you are willing to entertain that, there's a few things that I would ask of you. I would ask you to make some intentional commitments to do no harm, to stop speaking stink about that person to anybody. No more negative comments. Can you commit to that? Just intentionally. No negative asides to your spouse about that person. Can you commit to that? Commit to doing no harm. That's actually a practice in our Buddhist tradition. To cease from causing more suffering in the world. Well, if you're willing to make that commitment, doesn't mean you'll fulfill it perfectly, but you intentionally try to do no harm, then you can move forward. You can begin to move forward with this process. And as I said, this first huge piece, and depending on the depth of your wound, the length of the process could be long indeed. It's not a walk in the park. We're not talking about, oh, I'm going to forgive him now. It doesn't work like that. We're not built like that. It's going to take a while. And you're going to have to, this is not about reconciliation. It's not about going and talking to the other person and fixing something. It's about healing your own heart. It's about bearing your own existence, about being brave enough to be with yourself in a way that's real. The thing that we often miss about patience as a practice is that actually it's about the kind of spiciness. Patience, when it's real, when we get the real meaning of what patience is, it's about biting your tongue and feeling the tension of that. It's feeling the emotion. It's not being indifferent. We're not talking about moving on. We're not talking about ignoring or forgetting something. We're talking about actually coming to terms with this act that was done to you and how you feel about it. And then if you decide to forgive and that becomes more apparent to you, we just keep going. And then a pretty large part of this process begins to be about once you can be courageous with your own pain and be with it, then you can begin to reflect about this other person and reframe how you've been looking at them, the kind of assumptions you've been making about them that may or may not be accurate. And when you get through this, however long it takes, you can come to the point of actually finding meaning in your suffering. That's the last stage of the process of forgiving. And the last thing that has to be done for this to be real is you have to give the person a gift. You have to give them something. Not you have to consider what that gift would be, and you give it from a genuine heart of really wishing them well. This has to be real. You're not pretending. You're actually giving them a gift. Maybe the gift is you write them a letter. Maybe the gift is you call them up and ask to go out to a meal together. Maybe the gift is you never talk to them. Maybe the gift is you donate something to your favorite nonprofit in their name. We'll take your donation. Couldn't help it. It's too easy. Do you see what I'm saying, though? You have to give a gift. You have to give. You have to give up. You have to give up. And the surprising thing about forgiveness, and again, Robert Enright has done a lot of work on this. We have his book, Forgiveness is a Choice. We have he's written several books. He has a website. They have a Forgiveness Institute. You can read about the studies they've done with incest survivors and children in Belfast, kids at risk, and the results of their forgiveness work. But when people go through this process and come out the other side and really forgive, look at Nelson Mandela. How did he do that? He spent the prime of his life in prison and came out the other end. He wasn't bitter. Forgave the people that put him in prison. I was watching a documentary on Serena Williams the other night, and she was talking about Nelson Mandela, and she was struggling with her own reaction to being the prejudice directed towards her as a black athlete, playing in Indian Wells and to a largely white audience that was booing her, and how hurt she felt, and all of the negative things people say about her body as a woman. And then she met Nelson Mandela, and she said to herself, well, if he can do that, maybe I can too. And she's a beautiful, beautiful person. It's a beautiful documentary. It shows her how she is as a woman, black athlete. So people that come out the other side of this, that really forgive in this way, describe it as being released from prison. Just like Nelson Mandela, but being released from the prison of resentment and bitterness. And people would never have done this, would never go back into that prison again. Never. That's the power of forgiveness. It's the power to be liberated from your broken heart that becomes bitter and closed and shut down. And that's exactly what we're teaching here at the Zen Life and Meditation Center. We're teaching to live a Zen-inspired life of openness. You can either choose to open your heart or close it. And it's your choice. Moment by moment, we're always making choices. And the more mindful we become about what practice is, I think the more mindful we are of the choices we're making. Now, I had a whole list of all the misunderstandings about forgiveness I was going to read. I'll go through a few of them because they are important. People do misunderstand forgiveness. It's often understood as accepting what happened. But forgiveness, as I think you can understand now, doesn't mean simply moving on. You can move on with indifference and resentment. Ceasing to be angry doesn't seem to work either. You can just bury the anger, but that never works. It'll come out some other day for some other poor sentient human being that doesn't deserve it. Forgiveness is not about condoning or excusing the other person's actions. That's codependency. It's not about, you see, forgiveness is about really being courageous, really looking at the injustice and acknowledging it, not excusing it, not condoning it, not saying it was all right. Because that would be to blame yourself then. And we're back in the grip of shame. And that's toxic. Forgiveness is not about forgetting, and it's not about forgetting. You will probably never forget that act if it was a deep wound. You won't forget it, but you'll remember it differently. Memory is very, very pliable and flexible. It's not nearly as solid as we think it is. It can change. It's certainly not justifying the other person's behavior in any way, shape, or form. It's not about calming down and being mindful and peaceful. The trouble with mindfulness is the way it's often taught in our culture now. It's kind of becoming like yoga. It doesn't go downstairs. You can practice mindfulness and never go downstairs. No, go down in the basement. But if you don't go down in the basement, you're not going to know who you are. You don't deal with your own shadows. You're never going to be a full, no one's going to really trust you. You're not going to even trust yourself. So just calming down, just stress relief, mindfulness, that's fine. That's what people want to get out of mindfulness. But that's not, it's certainly part of what we're teaching at the Zen Center, but it's not all of it by any means. And in fact, if you look at how mindfulness is taught in our tradition, in our spiritual tradition in Buddhism, mindfulness is always considered to be a virtue, a moral virtue, connected with other virtues such as equanimity, compassion. It's an active virtue. It's not just some neutral paying attention. It's a matter of the heart. It's a matter of being embodied. Forgiveness is not about a pseudo-forgiving, just saying the words, I forgive you, doesn't mean you forgave somebody. That can be a knee-jerk reaction, you know, you just say, oh, I forgive you. No, not so quick. That's not real. Let's be honest, that's not real. So those are some of the misunderstandings of forgiveness. I'm not sure I really answered your question about people being afraid of being hurt again or opening themselves up. But I think the point here is that when you are empowered, you have choices and you can make more skillful choices about how you want to be. You don't have to be with that person again if they're going to hurt you again. You can actually say, well, I'm going to forgive this person for what they did to me, but I'm not going to invite that again, and I have the power to do so by the choices I make. Yeah.
It seems to me that people sometimes confuse it too with that I'm not going to hold them accountable for what they did.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, this is the simple world. Somebody breaks into my house. I can forgive them, but that doesn't mean that I don't want charges pressed against them.
Absolutely.
And that they receive, whatever consequences go along with their actions. So I think people tie those two things together. If I forgive them, I'm gonna let them go.
Yes, yes, holding them accountable, and there's a whole range of possibilities there. There are people whose family member has been murdered by somebody who forgive that murder and don't want to see them put to death in the electric chair, but probably have the perception and the experience that that person has paid for it in some way, even though they don't want them to be punished by the law in the traditional way. But I agree with you. Forgiveness,
In jail, perhaps.
putting them in jail, people should be held accountable for their